Sadiq Khan is feeling the wrath of Silicon Valley after blocking a procurement deal between Palantir and the Metropolitan Police. The Met Police had agreed a deal worth £50 million to use Palantir's technology in criminal investigations. But it's been blocked by the Mayor's office over apparent breaches to procurement rules. So the Deputy Mayor for Policing said the Met had only seriously considered or engaged with Palantir as potential supplier of these services and hadn't properly tested whether their services were value for money. So a fairly sort of bureaucratic, formal reason. It's this comment, though, from the Mayor's spokesperson that has provoked the most attention. So they said, the Mayor expects that Londoners would only want to see public funding go to companies that share the values of our city. So the decision by the Mayor's office and that explanation for it have prompted a furious response from Louis Mosley, who is CEO of Palantir UK.
Well, I think the Mayor is putting politics over public safety. He talks about values, but I think what Londoners value is not being mugged, not being raped by a serving police officer. And that's really what the focus here should be.
I suppose on the counter to that, this is democracy in action. He's been elected by millions of people. He doesn't have to do business with you. You don't have an inherent right to be a part of the Met Police's software procurement and the technology that they use.
But this comes back to then the rule of law. That is not in the rules. And if we're going to politicise procurement in that way, then we are going to compromise public safety. I'll give you another example. Tim Martin, founder of JD Wetherspoons, famously pro-Brexit. The Mayor, famously anti-Brexit. Arguably, the majority of London's anti-Brexit. Does the Mayor want to ban Wetherspoons from London?
That would involve closing a lot of pubs.
I think, we're going to look at another bit of Louis Mosley in a minute, but I just wanted to cut in there because the problem with that example is any Londoner can choose not to go into Wetherspoons, right? Whether or not there is a Wetherspoons. If I am sort of incredibly personally affronted by Tim Martin, I can just not go to Wetherspoons. It's not going to be the case that as a Londoner, if Palantir get this deal with the police, that I can say, you're not allowed to find me with your Palantir software. Not that they'd have any reason to find me. But you can't opt out of it, basically. Also, I think it just goes without saying that Palantir is much more critical infrastructure. The police's IT system is a much more critical infrastructure than pubs. And therefore, sort of the political sensitivity of it and the leverage. Because the important thing here is that if you control something which the police rely on, or the military, we take this for granted when it's the military, but I think it's the same with the police. And the same with the NHS, really. If that service becomes reliant on a private company, then that gives that private company an enormous amount of leverage in a way that opening a bunch of pubs does not give Tim Martin. Let's look at the rest of that clip of Louis Mosley.
Why is that directed at Palantir?
I think that's a question you need to ask the Mayor. Why does he take exception with our values and not with other tech companies? Why, for example, is it that we may work in Israel, but so does Amazon, so does Microsoft. We may work with the Trump administration supporting the immigration enforcement arm of his government. So does Amazon, so does Microsoft, so does every other tech supplier you can think of. Why do we get singled out? It's a very good question, and I would welcome you putting it to him.
So Mosley is right that Palantir is not alone as a tech company working with Israel or ICE. It has, though, done these things with particular gusto.
I'm very happy to have you along for the journey, and you are partners for us. Every Palantirian, we are crushing it. Everyone else who's listening, we are dedicating our company. We have dedicated our company to the service of the West and the United States of America, and we're super proud of the role we play, especially in places we can't talk about. And we love our success in the U.S. and globally. Also, we are doing in the United Kingdom and many other places. Palantir is here to disrupt and make the institutions we partner with the very best in the world, and when it's necessary, to scare enemies and on occasion kill them.
That was Palantir CEO Alex Karp speaking on an earnings call in 2024. Now, as part of its commitment to defending the West, which Karp argues should be more proud of its superiority over other cultures, Palantir has tied itself incredibly closely to Israel. So in October 2023, the company took out a full-page ad in the New York Times saying Palantir stands with Israel. Palantir also held a board meeting in Tel Aviv to show their full-throated support for the country. More meaningfully, more significantly, its technology has been used extensively in quote-unquote war-related missions, including identifying targets during Israel's genocide. Palantir is also at the forefront of the development of autonomous weapons, which many AI safety experts think could have catastrophic impacts. Catastrophic impacts, though, are something their co-founder Peter Thiel hasn't always seemed too fussed about.
You would prefer the human race to endure, right?
Uh,
You're hesitating.
Yeah, well,
yes?
I don't know. I would.
This is a long hesitation. This is a long hesitation.
There's so many questions implicit in
Should
this.
the human race survive?
Yes.
Okay.
But I also would I also would like us to radically solve these problems.
It's tense there. For a moment, I thought we were going to give control of the NHS and the police force to someone who doesn't want humanity to survive. But thankfully, reassuringly, after 20 seconds of humming and ahhing, he did finally confirm he does want humanity to prevail. He also said he wants problems to be solved. So the problems sort of in the rest of that interview, very interesting interview, by the way, included whether or not Greta Thunberg, who he refers to as the Antichrist, will bring about a one world government, and whether we can achieve radical life extension. I've got nothing against radical life extension, but I think the problem with many of these Silicon Valley people is they're sort of willing to risk everything so that they personally can upload their sort of minds to a computer and live forever, whether or not they have any democratic consent for these wild transformations they are suggesting they impose on society. The Metropolitan Police, for their part, still want access to Palantir's technology. So in response to Khan's veto, a spokesperson for the force said this: "The technology we want to introduce is crucial to maintaining our service to London while shrinking for the third consecutive year. Failing to introduce new technology to address back-office processes and build our effectiveness is the opposite of value for money. The technology has shown it can save much more than it costs and that it can improve performance. Without new technology delivered at pace, we will be forced to make further tough choices that cannot avoid reducing officer numbers, affecting our service to London and our ability to keep the capital safe." Palantir recently carried out work with the Met to identify police corruption and misconduct, including hundreds of officers across the force who had broken internal rules, who were under investigation for criminal offences. So I think the Met said they hope that this would increase confidence in the police. Obviously, the deal with Palantir means that has somewhat backfired. Banseka, what do you make of all of this?
Yeah, I mean, it feels, the way it's couched by that Met sort of statement, it makes it sound quite existential to basically say Londoners are going to be less safe if we don't do this, which I imagine is something that lots of people will respond to. And whilst I've obviously got my own skepticisms about, policing and how policing operates and whether it really makes people safe or not, it is kind of a continuation of sort of what we were talking about before, really, which is the ways in which austerity have created these gaps. And then platform capitalism has been able to kind of fill in its place. And the statements made by some of the individuals are not really, they're highly ideological, aren't they? They really are quite sort of highly ideological. And so I think there is a public interest. I think fairness on Sadiq Khan's part, good for him. I think that he's put a halt to this. And you're completely right about that lack of consumer choice. An absurd comparison to say it's the same as, deciding what pub you go into. I had an appointment at the NHS several months ago and they were using AI to capture our whole conversation. And I had no choice. No one even told me before I got in there that, AI was going to be used. And I tried to ask questions like, where's my data going to be stored? But it wasn't really answered. What am I going to do? Go private? So you've got no choice, I think, once the state chooses to give out these contracts to these AI tech firms that are privately owned. I think it's interesting as well. It's worth remembering Palantir have a lot of state funding, right? It's something around 55%. So they've couched themselves in terms of defending sort of Western values, which no doubt presumably includes a kind of rugged form of capitalism. And yet they are mostly state funded. They're mostly getting state contracts to do their work. I don't think they would exist, maybe certainly not as prolifically as they do, but without it. So there's all these contradictions are kind of riddled and involved in this. But honestly, good for Sadiq Khan for that pushback.
Yeah, I suppose he thinks he's sort of tacking left, and maybe it will, if he wants to stand again. Obviously, the Greens are going to be the biggest threat at the next election. So he might think that this is I suppose, parking his tanks on their lawn. I think he's probably done the right thing here. I do think it is very plausible to me that Palantir probably can do it better than anyone else for the NHS as well. Like, because these organizations don't have the in-house capacity to build a really effective system. I mean, obviously, especially for the NHS, it sounds like their in-house IT system isn't very good. I can see why a manager in the NHS, for perfectly honest, reasonable reasons, would say, we want to get the best system, and the best system is Palantir. Now, obviously, I'm not in a position to I can't write you a review of all the different patient data organization systems, but it seems perfectly plausible to me that they would be the most effective one. But then the question is, does that make sense as a long-term strategy?
Yeah.
And I mean, me and Aaron were talking on Wednesday or Tuesday, I'm not sure which day, about HS2 and saying the big problem with HS2 is that the state has lost all capacity to run its own engineering project. And therefore that means that, one, we can't control costs when we need it. We're way behind. You end up sort of relying on companies over which you have very little control. And this feels like one of those hinge moments, right? Where we could say, yes, we are going to need AI to do this integration. And the quickest way to get the best system is to buy in Palantir now. Or would it make more sense to say, okay, let's take our time. Let's say we've got 5 to 10 years to do this. And in that 5 to 10 years, we're going to build up the domestic capacity to have a homegrown, or maybe a European-based, maybe it doesn't have to be British, but you could say like maybe the EU could get together and say, instead of doing what we did before with Google and Facebook and everything, which is just rely on the American tech stack, let's invest in sort of our own companies and our own tech stack. And yes, it might take a bit longer, but this is technology which we're going to have for the next 50, 100 years maybe. So maybe we don't want to jump straight into bed with an American company that, I mean, Palantir is very clear. They do work for the American government in the sense that sort of the CIA had a big part in their founding. And, if Trump gets into a big conflict with Britain and sort of demands that Palantir do X, Y, Z, like, are they going to stick up for their British customers? I'm not so sure.
Yeah. And I think it's, there's kind of a sovereignty angle really ultimately to this, isn't it? We've had conversations about sovereignty since Brexit. Whatever you think about whether you vote to leave or remain, there are serious questions to answer about who owns Britain, who owns this country. Do people here who vote own this country and decide what happens, or is it all decided in Silicon Valley? My concern, I suppose, is once Palantir gets in, which it already has, it's already in our infrastructure anyway. How easy are they to remove?
Yeah.
If we're talking about, well, we do this in the short term, but in the long term, we're building up capacity to be able to do this on our own. I think we should. Goes back to some of the arguments we were talking about before with lack of jobs for young people. The jobs aren't really there. The state, I think, needs to do more to create those jobs. Why not create those jobs in something exciting like AI and AI for the people? But I don't know how easy it would be to remove Palantir if they were kind of there for the short to medium term whilst we build the capacity. Unfortunately, in this respect, we're not like China. China's got, they've got their China dream till, 2049, 2050. I
think it goes on forever, China dream.
It's indefinite. Oh, okay. It's just very, very exciting. I can feel
the worst some deadlines. I'm being disingenuous.
Well, the deadlines move, I think, quite a bit, don't they? But,
they meet their deadlines. They're much better at deadlines than we are.
Yeah. I mean, so they've got the capability. I find myself quite jealous of the capability that they've got to do this really long-term planning that, we can't even build HS2. So there are some really, really big choices to make here, right? Economically, about what we invest in and where. And I do think that these firms like Palantir, to me, they are vultures. I feel like they are vultures picking on the carcass of the sort of British state, really. And I'm worried that if we let them in too much, that it's actually going to be very difficult to get rid of them.
I mean, it's very similar in a way, actually, to the EU argument, because the Brexit argument, they always said, look, we know that leaving the EU might in the short term come with a hit. And it might make life more difficult because we're going to have to start taking responsibility for our own, borders is what they would say. But, those ways where we'd outsource decisions to the EU, we're going to have to make those ourselves. And even, the smart people in favor of Brexit all admitted, yes, there will be a short-term hit, but for long-term sovereignty, it's worth it. And you very rarely hear those same people saying the same thing about tech, right? Because I think that our reliance on American tech is probably, in the long term, a bigger inhibitor of our sovereignty than membership of the European Union. right? Because membership of the European Union was much more transparent. You know, you might find it bureaucratic or whatever, but we did get input into how it was run. There were lots of veto points. There aren't in Silicon Valley. They can do whatever they want.
Yeah.
So we have made ourselves completely reliant on a small amount of Silicon Valley-based tech firms over which we have no control. But all the people who found sort of some people in Europe, some bureaucrats in Europe who ultimately we helped appoint, them having a bit of control over a few rules and regulations, like that was an affront to sovereignty. So powerful, we had to leave and sort of risk slower growth for 10 years. But Palantir, we have to jump into bed with them immediately.
Yeah, and no kind of crickets from the right on on any of that. They've not got any solutions around that either. I mean, I selling people the kind of short-term pain for long-term, it's not an easy pill to swallow, is it? And people have heard that now. The problem is for 14 years because the Conservatives told us that with austerity, you know, a little bit of pain, but there'll be long-term gain. We're still waiting for the long-term gain, aren't we? So I don't know. I'm not an expert in this. I don't know if there are things that we can do to lessen that pain. I wouldn't be particularly amenable to sell. You know, people have had enough pain. We need to give people some hope. We need to give people some joy. We need to give people some excitement, you know, and telling people there's more pain to come in all for sovereignty, which is this kind of ethereal concept.
Yeah, you can phrase it in an exciting way, right? Which is we're going to build this incredible, amazing, homegrown tech scene.
Yeah, absolutely.
With a little dose of like anti-Yank nationalism. Just a little dose, a safe amount, a little drop.